Welcome everyone to today's Tuesday Times Roundtable. If you didn't see it on the way in, just so you know, there's some flyers about a Peace Corps information session. The South Florida Peace Corps recruiter is going to be on campus tomorrow, late afternoon, if you have any interest in learning more about that opportunity. And just as I always say, if you haven't been to a Tuesday Times Roundtable before, we're here with lunch and interesting conversation every single week, and you can grab the schedule card from up there too to see what we're talking about the rest of the semester. I'm very happy to introduce today's moderator. Claire Oueslati-Porter is a visiting instructor of sociology in FIU's Department of Global and Sociocultural Studies, also known as GSS. She holds a doctorate in applied anthropology from the University of South Florida. She received a dissertation fellowship from the American Institute for Maghreb Studies to conduct research with women workers in Binzart, Tunisia in 2008, and is currently developing a research project on the marketing of Tunisian soft drinks and the sociocultural dynamics of the metabolic syndrome epidemic among Tunisian women. Since receiving her doctorate in 2011, she has published in the Journal of North African Studies, the Middle East Media and Book Reviews Online, and Feminist Frontiers. So I'm happy to introduce to you today's Tuesday Times Roundtable moderator, Dr. Claire Oueslati-Porter. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's a great honor to be here. And when I saw that this was an opportunity to discuss a New York Times article, I thought what a great opportunity this is for a discussion, especially apropos sort of discussion for right now, right here, right now. So this is the article that I chose. Right. So this article, Foreign Jihadis Fighting in Syria Pose Risk in the West, is by Kamiko de Freitas, and it's one of the first articles the Times did that was really about this new group on the horizon called ISIS. It was before we were even sure we were going to call it ISIS or what ISIS was, right? We were still at the time talking more about Al-Qaeda, and it's sort of been receding, and then it's bound to sort of come back and bounce back. But the premise of the article is that these foreigners who might be Westerners from Europe, if you've seen any of the news coverage and you've seen social media by people who claim to be part of ISIS, sometimes they have very strong British London accents, right? You may have noticed that, right? That these fighters are going to be trained, further radicalized in Syria and Iraq, and then they might come back to home countries in Europe and in the United States and sort of wage some sort of jihad back in the West. And so this was one of the first articles to do that. So I thought I would choose this article way back in May, and it really was the beginning of a whole succession of articles that's really continuing in the New York Times on ISIS and ISIS fighters. So, and it's been such an interesting time. So how many of you watch Real Time with Bill Maher? Do you watch Real Time? Did you see this particular debate? Or maybe you heard something about it where Ben Affleck he just lost it and accused Bill Maher and some of his other guests of being racist toward Muslims. He went on a rant and he said, what about all the everyday Muslims who pray and eat sandwiches and all these other things? And now there's a Twitter hashtag called Sandwiches with Ben Affleck, and you can actually have a photo of yourself eating a sandwich and hashtag it through the Islamic Monthly. So it's just been a hot debate with Bill Maher and some of his guests claiming that most Muslims hold illiberal views. And views that are sort of that can't possibly mesh with modernity and things like that. Bill Maher's been really saying these things for a while, but it seems to have intensified. So it's an interesting and maybe a painful time to discuss what's happening with this group that seems to be called ISIS, or maybe ISIL, or maybe just IS. So. So this discussion is really going to be framed around Edward Said. So raise your hand if you've read Said somewhere, Edward Said in a class. Maybe you read part of Orientalism somewhere along the way. If not, Said's Orientalism was published in 1978, and then there was really, it was part of what became a trilogy of books. So first is Orientalism, and then the second one was The Question of Palestine, and then the third is Covering Islam, where he uses the framework of ideas that he develops in Orientalism to look at how the news, how popular media in the United States covers Islam in the news. And he starts with the Iranian Revolution. And his concepts and principles are quite important to our understanding of how and why we read the news and how we interpret what we're reading in the news. So one of his quotes I just threw up here is about the Orient. The Orient, in many people in North America's minds, might mean somewhere in Far East like China and Japan. But the Orient has historically, and by the Europeans, has been thought of as the Middle East and North Africa, sometimes called the quote-unquote Arab world, right? The Middle East, the Near East, all these sort of problematic and political terms we use for the East, right? So Said's quote, "The Orient is Europe's cultural contestant, and one of its deepest and most recurring images of the other," with a capital O, right? The other with a capital O. So what does this mean, this perception, this cultural contestant, and this perception of the Middle East and North Africa, the Orient, as an other? Basic definition of otherization: to view or treat a person or group of people, in this case, as intrinsically different from and alien to oneself. So otherization is discussed in many disciplines, for example, in women's and gender studies courses, right? That in patriarchal societies, perhaps women are otherized in certain ways. In discussions of how race and ethnicity tend to function, where racial and ethnic minorities are made into others with a capital O, as being strange, foreign, and different. Right? So here Said is saying that this is part of what's being done to the Middle East and North Africa in the Arab world. So we're using the New York Times here as a way to explore this otherization. Now, the New York Times is very powerful, and that's part of the reason why Edward Said takes so much time in posing a critique of the way the New York Times has for several decades now portrayed the Middle East and North Africa. It was a New York Times journalist, for example, who was publishing a lot of reports about Saddam Hussein having weapons of mass destruction. Right? Now we know at this point that those didn't exist there, right? But that the New York Times has been very important in shaping a certain public perception. Let's give an example of otherization from a few years ago, from more than what was that, like 8 or 9 years ago. When we make a group into an other, it can be very subtle or not so subtle. So here's just a clip from an article by Sabrina Tavernise, who's still writing, still very much part of the Times. The article is titled "A Cycle of Revenge Fuels a Pattern of Iraqi Killings." Tavernise's quote that I put up is, "In some cases, the force behind the cycle of revenge has its roots in Iraq's tribes. Iraqis are retreating to the safety of their tribes and the militias to which their members belong." So let's just break this down. So Tavernise first says, in some cases, it might be because of tribes. Right? And then later in the article, she says Iraqis are retreating to the safety of their tribes, and in some cases is gone. Right? Now it's just they're doing it. Later on in the article, she says more about tribes, but I didn't put it up there because it's too much text for a slide. But later on, she talks to a guy on the street, an Iraqi guy on the street, who says he's a history buff, and he assures her, "Oh yes, it's definitely that Iraq is a tribal society, and people are retreating back to their tribes. That's absolutely true." And there it is. So we have this iteration of this idea of tribalism 3 times. Right? What kind of people do we imagine belong to tribes? As Westerners, right? Who do we think has a tribal affiliation? Yes.
Native people?
So native peoples, and hopefully these days, having a tribal affiliation for a native person is seen as something that's legitimated. Historically, native peoples and their tribes were viewed how? When we think about tribalism. Yes. Uncivilized? Yeah, go ahead.
Savages.
As savage. Right. So here, the way tribe, this word is being used, this concept is being used, is to promote an idea that all this violence. Here's this photograph of this poor boy looking out in a stadium where some Shia boys were killed. Is that it's certainly suggested by Tavernese that this tribalism and this reverting to tribalism is savagery. Right. Now, anthropologists have thoroughly questioned the whole idea that tribalism even exists in the Middle East and North Africa to begin with. Right? There's a really big question mark there about what do we mean by tribalism. Do we really mean local agglomerations of power, like political power in parts of the Middle East and North Africa? And are we just calling that tribalism? Maybe we have local, agglomerations of power too here in the West, but we're not calling it tribalism. And maybe that's political. So here's one example from the past. So Said argues in Orientalism that the Orient, the Middle East and North Africa, is portrayed by Europeans and now by other parts of the West, especially by the United States in media, as not just barbaric, but having been a once great civilization that's fallen back down into barbarism. That was a contention of the Europeans as well. That the Middle East and North Africa is decadent, and it's portrayed as in a state of decay, and all that means, right? So in a state of decay in terms of its great civilization sort of being falling apart, its tribal system decaying, the once great civilization in terms of sexual depravity. We hear a lot of reports about ISIS and their horrible sexual dealings with Yazidis and things. Its tendency toward irrational violence. Right? So the European conception was that when the West did violence, there was a reason for it. Right? It was well thought out. But that in the Middle East and North Africa, violence was irrational. Right, which goes along with this idea of savagery. And the primary focus for all of this is on the problematics and what's made problematic about Islam in these perceptions. So there tends to be an overemphasis on Islam and its role in the dealings of the Middle East and North Africa. And Said discusses this quite extensively in Covering Islam, the third in his trilogy. So how can we counter this? It's important to pursue antithetical knowledge, as Said says. So that's great, most of the people in the room, right? Because he said that it would be young people, young scholars, who would be best suited to pursuing this antithetical kind of knowledge, right? To seek out and try and understand the kinds of hegemonies that are promoted in the news, and then to try and deconstruct them, to try and break them down. So that's what we're doing here, right? So let's move on. My research site, just to say really quickly, is Tunisia. And when I conducted research, the dictator, Zine Ben Ali, was still there, and his image was everywhere. So on billboards and the sides of buildings. And there he was, always watching over the people. This is a thing that dictators tend to do, right? They tend to look over the people. Now, Tunisia had been declared one of the top 10 least free countries in the world by Human Rights Watch. We know now from WikiLeaks that people in the U.S. government did indeed know and even said that Ben Ali was sort of like he operated like a mafia family. Right? But Tunisia remains one of our close allies in the region, despite this kind of knowledge. When Ben Ali was deposed as a dictator, what happened really quickly is that some formerly banished Islamists, politicians, came right back into the new democratic scene, and indeed they won. They won in Democratic votes. And the New York Times published some articles expressing a kind of an unease with this. Even titles like Tunisia is uneasy over the party of Islamists. However, most Tunisians really weren't. And nothing horrible or radical happened when the Islamists came into power democratically. But the way that the New York Times was kind of portraying it maybe didn't really promote the idea that Islamists could be Democrats and could be democratic in their thinking. And Rashid Ghannouchi, who's there in the middle of the crowd, indeed promoted democracy. Tunisia continues to be relatively stable. So let's get back to the article at hand. All right, so foreign jihadis fighting in Syria pose risk in the West. So again, this is one of the early articles published May 29th. So De Freitas says one of the most popular and extreme of the fighting groups among Westerners in Syria calls itself the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or ISIS. So it's really the beginning of reports. So I'm just going paragraph by paragraph. So some of this will open to discussion. De Freitas does research with a guy through texting, through social media platforms like Kik here. So the interview is not face-to-face with Abu Muhajir, who's a young guy, and he describes himself as probably being from the United States, growing up here in the United States, from a religious family. Goes into extensive detail about him saying he had no non-Muslim friends growing up in the United States. Okay. So the question then becomes, how do we know what we know about ISIS or ISIL or IS? And it might be important to kind of situate this in what has happened in the past. So people from my generation probably remember seeing in the news quite frequently these kinds of images of Al-Qaeda training on monkey bars somewhere, right? It was in the news quite a bit for quite a long time after September 11, 2001, right? So we have to wonder what Al-Qaeda has to do, its representations have to do with ISIS today and how ISIS is being represented. All right, so we have Brett McGurk saying it's Al-Qaeda and its doctrine, its ambition, and increasingly in its threat to U.S. interests. In fact, it's worse than Al-Qaeda. We've heard lots of reports about this. Right? We know that all kinds of horrible brutalities are happening under ISIS. So Abu Muhajir moves on to say that he suggested that Western governments could indeed have a cause to be worried that these foreign jihadis in Syria might someday return home to carry out attacks. It's a suggestion, right? It's just a suggestion that he's making when he's texting her on social media. Right, that they might come home someday to commit this kind of acts. But, I mean, the entire title of the article is Foreign Jihadis Fighting in Syria Pose Risk in the West. Right, so there's got to be some more kind of solid evidence, right, to justify the article being called, we have to worry about ISIS fighters coming back. In paragraph 4, we learned that about 70 Americans are thought by intelligence to be fighting, possibly, with ISIS, although officially they've gone to Syria to fight the government of President Bashar al-Assad. And here's what really doesn't get covered, if we talk about an absence in an article, is Bashar al-Assad. Very little mention of him and his role in these mostly men's decision to go and fight in Syria. So if we move in here, I just highlighted a little bit here in this particular text. They're telling these stories, and they provide some insight into their motivations and outlook as extremist groups with ties to Al-Qaeda to try and identify, recruit, and train men from the U.S. and Europe to carry out attacks when they return home. Now, we hear that this is according to these intelligence and counterterrorism officials. And yet, as we'll see later in the article, there's also the acceptance that there's no credible evidence at this time that they pose a risk. Now we have to focus on another British jihadi, also fighting in Syria. He says that once when he was younger, he was a bad Muslim, right? He didn't really care. He took drugs and, he went to he partied and did all these things and worried his mother. So again, we get a certain kind of perception here, a kind of portrayal of these young men as they grow up in the quote unquote West, right? It's quite selective what goes into the article. Okay. So again, Abu Muhajir was interviewed on Kik, which is a social media platform that's very popular with ISIS and with these foreign fighters. Interestingly, he himself says he won't divulge his real name. And then if you look at the last sentence, although he identified himself on Ask FM, a social media site, as American jihadi, or he says whatever they're calling it. So he's very aware that there's a kind of perception going on, right, of them themselves. So wait a second, does that mean we shouldn't even be calling them jihadis? Wait a second, what does that word jihadi really mean? Right, and how is it being used here strategically? Are these guys using it because they think that's what the Western media is calling it? Or do they really consider themselves part of a jihad? So anyone want to give a basic definition of what jihad actually means? Anyone in the audience? Yes, go ahead. Well, there's one interpretation that would be linked with holy war, right, as jihad. But there's another jihad that's called the big jihad. Right, yeah, go ahead. It means to strive for something in a religious context, and often the way that Muslims tend to understand this is that the jihad is really within oneself, to overcome one's personal challenges, right? But the way it gets used in the West is most certainly as this is about fighting a holy war, right? This is about war and militarism and terrorism and all these kinds of things. But we see here there's a kind of ambivalence here on the part of these fighters as, maybe they're just calling us jihadis. Okay, and then back to the British guy. He says he has no intention of bringing jihad back home. He has no intention at all. He plans to die in Syria, he said, and hopes for a rewarding afterlife. So again, we have to take pause here and think about, what is this? What does this mean in terms of what the title of the article is and in terms of what's likely to happen in the West? Okay. Now in paragraph 17, it takes us all the way to paragraph 17. Before we get this, both men said they were appalled by the West's failure to halt the killing in Syria. That is the mass killings of Bashar al-Assad, who has been left in power. Right? There were moments, strategic moments, when perhaps the U.S. or other Western countries could have stepped in. Right? So Bashar al-Assad has been dropping things like barrel bombs into civilian neighborhoods, talking about possibly 100,000 people who've been killed, civilians who've been killed. We're talking about 200,000 or more who've been displaced in refugee camps across borders. Right? But it takes us to paragraph 17 to hear that this might be the reason. We've heard all kinds of things about their personal backgrounds, the personal shortcomings. So we get one sentence highlighted there about the killing in Syria. And then an immediate change, right? And this is where it's important to do this antithetical knowledge work. The immediate change too, they're also united in this wider goal to establish a caliphate ruled by Sharia, even if it's not the ideology shared by most Muslims in the region. So we've changed again, and we're turning back to Islam again as an explanation, rather than staying on political economy, maybe, on the politics of Bashar al-Assad and what might be considered a genocide happening there. So there's a strategic choice to move away from this issue, too. So on your right, there's Bashar al-Assad. Did you know who he was before I said it? Yes? Okay. And then on the left, this photo was published in the New York Times. It's a photo still taken from one of ISIS's many videos that they post on social media. So the guy holding the gun, whose face is covered, is an ISIS fighter. And the guys behind are ISIS fighters, and they are leading off a group of men. We don't know who they are. We could probably suspect they're maybe Shia or Yazidis or another minority. We're not really sure at this point. But when we juxtapose the two, we have to ask ourselves a question. How has Bashar al-Assad been able to maintain legitimacy, and how has ISIS's standing always been as a group that absolutely, totally must be fought against? So moving on to paragraph 21. Part of its appeal comes from its extensive public outreach. Experts say the group is most prolific on social media compared with other groups. Well, this is interestingly Orientalist, right? Did we really think that a group operating now wouldn't be able to use social media? Does anybody these days not use social media? Or did we kind of suspect that they might be sort of trapped in some other century? Another article did this very well. So the Scott Shane and Ben Hubbard's article, ISIS displaying a deft command of varied media. And the text line here from the article is, if its bigotry and beheading seem to come from a distant century, its use of media is up to the moment. Again, as if there was some sort of shock or surprise about this adept use of social media. Back to the article. All right, so September 11th, 2001. We know that they would have been young guys growing up in the West here, interested in video games and sports and that kind of thing. Both say they were deeply affected by the subsequent invasion of Afghanistan, Iraq, American drone strikes, things like that. But again, this is not explored any further than this paragraph, right? What does it mean for people to, to see things like drone strikes and innocent civilian deaths? What kind of impact does that have on them? We wait until paragraph 22 to get into this, and then we move on very quickly, right? At that point, any comments about this particular piece of text? Would it have made a difference if it was earlier on in the piece that we thought about this kind of background impact, instead of hearing about one guy who used to kind of be use drugs and party and things like that? Would it have been more helpful for us to know this kind of thing earlier on about them, to think about what it means to people who may have suffered some sort of discrimination post 9/11, who were growing up here? Yes.
I think it's the context that they want, I guess, persuade the reader to have. Like, they could have given him this kind of context earlier, but they want everybody to associate it with all the other stuff, like you said, the drinking and the partying and all that.
As a sort of as if these guys were mostly interested in some sort of puritanical brand of radical Islam.
When they obviously have deeper feelings, they obviously are a lot more sentimental than they are portrayed to be.
Okay, so I mean that's an important point. Does anyone else want to respond to this comment about that? Why this didn't show up earlier on in the article? Why it shows up toward the end? Okay.
It's easier for them to see them as less human.
Okay,
like,
so going back to
see them kind of negatively first, and then because it's kind of like if you pay more attention to the way people right now, you don't really get. They want you to. Most people don't read an article more than 2 pages. They don't read past the first page. A lot of people just read the first page and then they go, "Okay, I got the idea," and they leave. So they put everything in the first page that they want you to think, and then the reality kind of comes in later on to put in like what you have to put in, otherwise you look like an unfit journalist.
So would you agree with that? When you read articles, do you sometimes skip out before you read to the end?
Some people just read the headline.
Maybe just the headline. Oh wow! If we just read this headline.
I had a conversation with one of my friends, I think this weekend, and one of them told me that she only read the first 2 paragraphs, and then the other person told me that they never read the first 2 paragraphs.
So
I think that the way that people go about reading articles or anything in general is probably a lot less than the writer would like.
Yeah.
And I also think that part of it is that they want to remove any association of maybe the U.S. being a reason for people feeling that way. Like the things with 9/11 and the drone strikes, which I actually just saw on Tonight with John Oliver. I think it was not this week, but the weekend before, he had a piece on drone strikes, and I believe in Yemen. which was incredible. But I think that that's part of it too. The New York Times being obviously one of the most well-read papers in the U.S., wanting to, I guess, kind of disassociate the U.S. with any kind of, with any kind of, I guess, result of or consequence, anything that they've done actually being consequence for the things that have come up, including ISIS.
It's interesting to think what if in 2011 or 2012 another decision had been made about confronting Bashar al-Assad. Where did ISIS come from? Well, we're talking about 70 or maybe a few hundred coming from the West, these foreign jihadis, right, that are here. So, but that's not most of ISIS members. Who are they? They seem to be people who are Syrians, who were rebels, who were getting very little support or funding, and then sort of were able to grow a beard and get a gun if they didn't have one, and move into the kind of power and support that ISIS seems to have garnered. ISIS, of course, controls a lot of oil refineries now. ISIS has a whole bureaucratic wing. They're very good at making sure the grain mills work on time, and they even are out there directing traffic in a lot of places. So that they have a lot of money and organization there, right? So it seems to be that there are a lot of Syrian rebels who joined ISIS, and the heart of ISIS seems to be, from what we know, from the best of our knowledge, seems to be Sunnis who were disenfranchised under the al-Maliki government in Iraq. The al-Maliki government in Iraq tended to be made up mostly of his networks that were mostly Shia, right? So who put together, who was responsible for really constructing this Iraqi government under al-Maliki? Well, there isn't, the U.S. was key in doing this, right? The U.S. was key in doing this. So that really doesn't get discussed here in this article. It's discussed in some other articles, for sure. I mean, it's not that it's completely ignored, but it certainly needs to be there, perhaps. Any other comments about that piece of it? Yes?
In this paragraph, I see that, I think the first sentence is that the men, they actually state, I guess, a rationale, that they state a reason for, I guess, you could say, for waging jihad, whatever that may mean to them. And I guess, with the first sentence here is that they start off with a young man who now calls himself Abu Muhajir, and then he slipped into Syria with his friends with $80,000. And then they add this, I guess, this adjective for taking a job as a high school teacher. I mean, why is that important? Because I guess I guess the majority here, we think that as normal, why would you leave your job? I don't think that is really important, that aspect, but putting it there.
Right at the beginning.
Yeah. I guess it makes them farther away as, I guess, rational human beings, and more like the foreign jihadists.
Oh, so you see sort of something that Edward Said would say is this kind of focus on irrationality, or seeming irrationality.
Because I think if you come into any conversation or any discussion with any people, how different they are, how similar they are to you, is that if you come to them with a firm conviction of who they are without even, I guess, giving them the chance to even look at them. And even when you do, I guess, start to discuss with them, I guess cultural differences, political differences, economic differences, it makes communication very hard. And also when the language is different. If other people, they have a different culture and different economic, I guess, conditions and political conditions, and the language is different, then for them to speak your language, and all of their experiences is then subdued into your culture and what you know. So I guess that could be a problem there when we communicate.
Excellent. Does anyone else want to add to that? Yes.
I think that's very true, and some readers would probably leave with that sense that this guy is clearly a nut if he's leaving a good job as a teacher. Others, the parents, might even freak out by saying, oh, this could be my child's science teacher. This could be the Walter White, but of the crazy Islamic, someone who seems mild-mannered, but really could turn into a monster.
Okay, so Yeah, and this is a serious concern, especially when it comes to things like Islamophobia in the U.S., hate crimes against Muslims or anyone perceived to be Muslim who might be like a Sikh with a turban or something. It's up 125%, those kinds of hate crimes. And not just the hate crimes, but the suspicion, the wider kind of suspicion of Muslims in the U.S. Are there other comments on that? Yes.
I think within the context, it perhaps can be seen as having the sort of implications that we spoke of, but we also need to take into consideration some may seem as sort of strange, perhaps by the way the article is constructed, perhaps it is looked as otherization, but at the same time, if we frame it in the right context, we can see that these people are sort of forsaking a normal life to go wage a war against a dictator, which was done by many Americans, for example, in the Spanish Civil War. And they themselves, so to speak, forsake their normal lives because they saw the evils of the Franco dictatorship and they went overseas to fight. And I think that with the right framing, perhaps we can see somewhat of what where they're coming from in this particular context. But at the same time, the sentence itself isn't the problem. Perhaps maybe it's the context that could be seen as an issue here.
Yeah. Okay. So that's important too. That there are maybe multiple ways to read the article and to understand, what's happening. Someone else can say something. But I heard.
Oh, I agree with what he's saying. It's just completely what he's saying. It's just if it was written, it's more we're coming from now. It's more about the author's
Choices, yeah.
to write it. Like why did the author choose to write it? Make these people look bad first, and then give them more humanity later. Why is that? Like, why would you use this structure? That's what I think.
Yeah, I think I follow along the lines of what she was saying. I think ultimately she structured it, or it's structured in the way that it is, because it's hard to change someone's mind about a person they've already made up their mind about. If I'm meeting you and whatever comes first, I've already made my mind who you are, so you trying to convince me later that you're somebody different is going to be really difficult, and that's the way she kind of structured this. In the beginning, she structured them as what we would consider bad people or irrational people, and then at the end, she gives them humanity, which is like, no, it's not going to change my mind about you.
Okay. Thank you for that. Yes.
I think a lot of this is a result of like this whole like the way the media is structured. I mean, just because you have the clicks now, because like the media is dying, and even like I don't know this woman, so she may not actually believe what she's like lying. Like she may be like totally neutral on this, but like if she wants to get more like people like reading the article, because they sell ad space, right? So people need to like click the article so the ads, so the ads and like the pay the money and whatnot. So like in order to get more people, she needs to say something like the West is at risk from importing foreign jihadis instead of like as a result of the Syrian political status or like the political state in Syria. I don't know, like how to describe ISIS like without making them sound like this.
Well, I don't know that we necessarily need to make them sound like anything what they are. I mean, we have plenty of real reports about them, sex trafficking and and doing horrible things. So.
Like the way to get people to click on an article is to sort of like prey off basic emotions like fear, really, and including everyone in this whole like jihadi, because like even the word jihadi for some people is like this whole Islamic thing. It's not a Syrian thing. It's not an Iraqi thing. It's like this whole Islamic thing fighting against the West, which is everything from like Europe to America. It's like, and while like ISIS is this like it's a huge problem, but they're still blowing it out of context in this way made just to get more people to read something. It's even the article itself, like everything is sort of the fault of economics, because like the entire way we structure our media is to get more money to things that feed off things created by more money. Like to clarify myself, like the political status of the Middle East is sort of like as a result of like drawing these like forced borders that we've done like a bunch of years ago, and like created all these political conflicts, and like as a result these political conflicts like these movements arise, and then they like cover themselves in like Islamic imagery or maybe like Christian imagery or Jewish imagery or whatever, but they're really just social groups fighting for control. And then instead of like representing this as social groups fighting over control, like the media portrays it as like this whole religious thing. It's like in South America with like liberation theology. It was this whole like socioeconomic thing that was happening, but they brought in like this whole religious context as sort of like a motif, a justification, and like whatnot to sort of like give their movement like a sort of life to it, you know?
So you think it's important to kind of situate this in sort of larger,
This is
a larger framework.
primarily an economic thing more than a religious thing, because even ISIS is sort of like as a result of like years of turmoil in the Middle East.
Yeah.
And then like you have this group coming up, it's vying for power more than anything. It's not doing it for like the Quran or anything, it's vying for power. But they take Islam and they sort of cover themselves in it to give themselves like this purpose, like that they just sort of paint on themselves.
And that can be like a more or less thing. I mean, it may be that it's convenient, to kind of use this as a sort of a theological justification, and it may be also, about resources. Perhaps we could say this, like you're saying, about a lot of conflicts in the world. That's a really important point. To look at these final paragraphs, though, then you're going to have to decide here if you think this is further humanizing the group, or if we're somehow getting this. I don't even know how to. So one of the final paragraphs is he has also received marriage proposals. Like he's in Syria fighting, which he declines. He says one woman asked whether electricity was working so she could use her curlers, and he texted to people in general, don't bring your hair curlers if you're planning to come to Syria. Now we know there are reports of people getting married. The ISIS is, is also administering marriages, official marriages, and things like that. But it's a strange way to lead up to an ending to an article, to devote this much space to this when we had like one or two sentences on Bashar al-Assad, right? So what do you think it means to lead up? I think this was like the third to last paragraph, little paragraph, the end. Yeah.
I think it's a bit of a non sequitur, the whole part of the hair curlers and all that. But then again, followed by graph where he says that everyone in the UK is living in some sort of bubble. I think that sort of connects to it.
There's that.
We're living sort of these lifestyles that we don't have to worry about a dictator attacking us all of a sudden or killing our families. But at the same time, I think it's rather unfair to say that they're failing to cover the Assad angle to it, because this is more focused on these jihadis as opposed to Assad himself. And we've received numerous coverage, including numerous statements by politicians all throughout the West, all throughout the world, except for perhaps Russia, that support that show that, look, Assad is killing his people, he's using these chemical weapons, he's being a maniacal dictator, and we can't stand for something like that. And although now is when we're actually taking action, bombing things, but I think it's a little unfair to accuse the authors of ignoring the angle. I believe that she was probably focusing on a different angle as opposed to what we had focused before, which was Assad.
This is more sort of almost an individual and a little bit of a psychological profile in certain ways. Yeah. Okay, yeah, go ahead.
I agree with what you're saying, but the hair curl thing, like the whole marriage proposal, it's kind of like how, like, to me it's more like they're framing it in the sense of how they put, like, if you go look about serial killers, and how a lot of serial killers have had gone to jail and then they get all these wedding proposals from women and all this, like they get, like,
Fame?
Yeah, like they become like these stars in their own right, and these women send them like, oh, I want to marry you and all that stuff, and that's kind of how I see that wedding proposal thing. Is like, even they're still like, even though that they're doing this crazy thing, women still want to marry them and stuff. Like that's how I perceive that. Like kind of making them seem like kind of a little off, and then like even more off by this like. Making women that would.
Yeah, what does it say about these? Who are these women, right? Who who are interested in doing this, who need like the converter plug for their hair curling irons or something to go if the electricity is working. Yeah, we don't hear too much about the women here. There are some articles that focus on the women who have become part of ISIS in some way, there are places where you can read texts from women who are, part of ISIS. But I mean, that's part of it too. Does this also make them further into an other, or is this part of kind of presenting us with a sort of a portrait of the personalities and psychologies of these Westerners who've gone to fight in ISIS? Yes.
Makes me actually wonder if the editor put the title on there, because if you look at a lot of the article, it could be titled "Passionate Men Go to Fight for What They Believe," and that would actually, the hair curl, it all like kind of builds up this persona. These are actually somehow superheroes who are leaving behind their comfortable life to fight for something they believe, and it's really the title that gets you thinking, like, oh, they're trying to present this crazies or whatever, not so much the language. I'd have to read it again, but.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem like the title is off. Yes.
I actually work for the paper here. That's exactly how it works. Like we can offer titles that we want, but they're always chosen by either the director or the copy editor that edits your story.
So maybe it goes back to this economics issue, too. Well, yeah, the final, the final paragraph begs all kinds of questions, as we've said. But interestingly, in these polls, 71% of Americans think that ISIS has terrorist sleeper cells in the United States. Now, this is not all, because of the New York Times. This is all kinds of media where the suggestion is made that perhaps ISIS is stockpiling weapons, even in some reports saying under U.S. mosques. That somehow this is being conflated more and more with Islam and Muslims here in the United States. We hear that, kind of discourse out there. A certain politician whose name I shall not mention saying that ISIS cells were going to start coming through the U.S.-Mexico border, so we really need to try and seal the border without any kind of credible evidence to suggest this. There are other kinds of implications for this as well. So in another New York Times article, the U.S. steps up fight to block ISIS volunteers. The emphasis is mine here. At the end, there are no active plots against the United States from within the United States. There doesn't seem to be any evidence, but I don't know that if that message is really become clear, or if that's more obfuscated from this kind of article. So I guess I could open up if we still have time, if anyone has comments about that. Yeah.
I think that the article suggests there are a couple of graphs that mention how there could be some sort of risk. And I would agree that perhaps some of these individuals will receive radical training or fall in with the wrong group while they're fighting. And having their entire lifestyle change. And then they come back and they could make some plots. I mean, we know of people who never even went to Syria and decided because of their Chechen heritage, they decided that they would put a bomb in a Boston Marathon. But there is still an element that needs to be stated that, we don't know that there's an active plot, we just know there's a possibility that there's a risk. I think the media should emphasize that while there is no public knowledge that's been released to the public of some sort of attack being thought of, ISIS has made statements, and there have been other individuals who seem to claim that they're going to do it. They haven't actually done it yet. And we are worried about some sort of risk. There needs to be some sort of clarification that needs to be made that while there is a risk, there's no evidence that they are planning to do so.
Right, yeah, and that seems to be what gets lost here, is that there isn't any, there doesn't seem to be any evidence that there is that kind of plot going on. But, there might be rather large implications for us here in the United States of many people in the United States believing this, right? And perhaps it has to do with other forms of media too, like if you watch the program like Homeland, right? Or, it has antecedents as well that may suggest that there are terrorist cells operating in the U.S. and that they're very active. So I don't know if anyone else has comments on this particular. Yes?
I think that can be said about a lot of places, though. Like, for example, Colombia. Anybody can go to Colombia and get guerrilla training and come back and plant a bomb. But there's nothing that. I think it's just a cover-up. I think it's a way of using national security as a way to just impose on more of our rights like they already have, and just keep a closer grip on every single person that comes in and out from anywhere, to be honest.
Okay, anyone else?
Add to that,
Yeah.
it's a lot easier to control people in council.
Like it happened after 9/11, they put cameras everywhere, and now it's allowed to put cameras even in a public
If you just,
restroom,
like,
and the whole.
well, I'm not saying that the editors are like in a conspiracy with the government or whatever, but I'm saying that it's much easier to skew the wording of what your reports are to reporters to make it like government people. You just skew it a little bit, and then suddenly you have an easy way to write a title that sounds really like, oh, I got to read this quick title, and then, oh, there's sleeper cells in the U.S. If you just skew it, you have conflict within the nation, because then you have problems with people. Like, if you make it a religious thing, you have problems. Oh, all of a sudden they're underneath mosques instead of potentially inside of a warehouse in the middle of a corporate entity for some reason. It's easier to have conflict within a nation when it's about ethnic or religious or racial problem rather than an actual social issue or economic issue. Because if it is an economic issue, then we start questioning our own economics and what's wrong with us and what's with our problem. No, we got to be looking at other people or what others are doing, because then we are afraid. The more fear that you have, the easier it is for you to go, oh, I need protection, when you don't really need protection. All you need is to actually be able to see that the government wants you to be afraid, so that way you need it, instead of them needing you to have the ability to govern in the first place. If that makes sense.
I think it's a good combination of willing to do almost anything for security.
So but then are you saying that you think this is some sort of a conspiracy? I mean, on the part of politicians or media or something? Or is it better to think of it, I mean, or might there be some other way to think of it other than...
I think it's mostly fear-mongering, to be honest. Making something that probably is a threat into a, making something that's a probable threat into making it seem like a for sure threat. And just that, level of differentiation between people, will make them vote for a war or against a war.
Okay, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, one is, I think it's important also to take into consideration the context of the paper, this paper, when New York Times falls New York Times. I mean, it's usually Jewish families who's signing the paper. And obviously, there are a lot of differences, philosophical and religious differences between them. And I would say directly emphasizing or blaming a group of a sector of the population here or overseas. But the writer obviously accomplishes the main the purpose of the paper when it expresses the concern of the jihadis fighting in the West. And I think legitimizes the view of many people amongst us who look different or grow beards, let's say like I do, and they're in college. They traces parallels between 2011 attacks of kids, she expresses, who were in college or were playing video games, and people who go now to these parts of the world and become radicalized. I think it demonizes people who live in the West, and legitimizes the concern of fighting in these arenas and spending resources in these parts of the world against an enemy that can be ubiquitous and can have any form.
And well, I mean, we can. I'm not sure. I mean, for sure, but a concern just at the very beginning, when we're talking about religion, what role the religion of the people who own the paper might be. That may or may not have anything to do with the other points you were making, right? I mean, It might be that the issue of the sort of ethnic identity of the owners of the paper is not relevant to the other points you were making. Yeah. I don't know if you want to speak more to that, to that issue if somebody else wants to jump in on that one.
Chances to that, like anything else in life, it's either it influences or it doesn't. It was 50-50. But to this point, it looks evident that it was a purpose in writing this paper, this title, and it was accomplished by tracing paths that could be or could not be related at this point, and especially when they point out the difference between Islam and Muslims, for example, is somewhere in the paper. I'm not sure, obviously, that was the intent, but it just seems like it.
So you would say that this article does kind of promote a certain kind of view of Islam.
Exactly.
Yes.
Some disjointed thoughts going over the entire conversation, so forgive that. I think that I definitely agree that the biggest problem is the headline more than the article itself, and not even just because some of it might be inaccurate, but just because it's not really what the article is about from a journalistic standpoint. Even if there's not a lot of evidence that there's a risk in the West, it just barely talks about it and makes some of the references there, but it's really about these two people. And I think it's a really interesting article to use to talk about otherism, and I try to be sensitive to otherism, and I spend a lot of time in these roundtables every week for 4 years now. And I notice that even when people are speaking positively about a group, and this comes up in immigration a lot, you still get a lot of the word they. They're just coming here to try to make a better life for their family. And I think even in that context, they create an otherism. And so I think this is an interesting article because it talks about two people. It uses their names, even if they're not their real names. And it does humanize them in some way. And it shows how the way things are ordered can still otherize people. I'm not sure that everything we've discussed, at least when I read it, creates them as others to me. I think the example you have in the other article about social media, where it directly invokes that you would be surprised about it, I think that creates otherism. I don't think the way they do it in this article really does, because I don't read anything that says that it's surprising. It's just they do it. It's one of the reasons that they have so much notoriety. I don't know what the statistic is to them compared to other groups, but it says they're more prolific than other groups if they actually have done research and know that they use it more, then it's just taking time in that particular one. And I even think that when it talks about them being bad Muslims who club and date women and cook drugs, I think that humanizes them too, rather than setting them up for otherizing them, because I think it's a relatable experience for people of any religion to struggle with meeting the expectations of that religion. But I do agree that the way that they downplay Bashar al-Assad and that reason for joining it is problematic. And various things that
I think actually that they are humanized to a certain extent, but I do think this article does otherize them, because I think it's in a very superficial way. And I think the only time they come close to looking at the true complexity of why someone would give up their life to go to their country is in only a few times in this paper where they talk about how these guys were questioning their position in the West, after September 11th. I would like to see what is all the information this author had in asking the question. What did she not include? Because I feel like there's something missing from what she chooses to present. I feel like it's a very complicated question, and that these people probably did a lot of soul searching before they made this decision, and there are a lot of reasons why they chose to do what they did. But this article doesn't address them. And especially at the end of the article, where it seems so, very superficial, like they do this and they are, people want to marry them, and et cetera, et cetera. Like the end of the article, I'm like, what? There's no resolution there, and I think that that's the point where they are kind of further otherized, because they're saying human things about these people, what they did, what they do, but not in a way that provides any depth and kind of ignores a lot of the context that even the limited context that
their proposal thing does, in the context of how much space they used, was not worth that amount of space. For sure. And it would be really interesting if it's out there accessible anywhere, to have the entire KIC transcript would be a fascinating research project to spend on what was included and not included in sociology of neuroscience.
There are some hands up. Do we have time to? Or
We have no.
Someone who didn't say anything yet. No.
People can chat for a few minutes, I suppose.
Do you want to?
I will go ahead and thank you now for being the great discussion and being my moderator.
Thank you so much.
Everyone for coming.
It's really, thank you. It was really excellent.